books have been the starting point of our first conversation this evening, and a book is also the starting point for our second conversation today. Typically, when a book goes underground, when it finds an underground audience, when it finds a stolen PDF or people mailing each other copies which are not legally yet available, you think you're talking about, the next J.K. Rowling or the next Stephen King. But a rather unusual thing happened to the book of our next speaker, Aishwary Kumar, published by Stanford University Press in 2015. The book was not available in India, and yet by the time it found its Indian publisher 2 weeks ago, it had pretty much been everywhere in the hands of those who were interested. Why does a book about Gandhi and Ambedkar in 2019 find this underground audience? Why does a book called Radical Equality resonate with so many people? What is radical equality? To have that conversation, it's my privilege to invite on stage somebody he's a political philosopher, political theorist. He's based out of Stanford, where he's taught for 13 years. But more than that, at the heart of Aishwary Kumar's work is a profound concern with the ideas of democracy, justice, equality, freedom. And those are some of the strands we will touch on in this conversation tonight. It's a pleasure to invite up on stage Aishwary Kumar. Aishwary, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me again.
When you started, I think it's been a decade and a half of your work around the figures of Gandhi and Ambedkar. Why did a young scholar in the early 2000s find these two much studied figures of interest?
I think the answer lies quite explicitly on the surface of your question. Part of how we understand our own political tradition is through acts of or figures of heroic action. We get interested in thinkers, we get interested in philosophers and politicians because to us, something very intrinsically heroic about them appeals. And it appeals to us in a way that speaks to both the historical moment in which they appeared and to our own contemporary concerns. I've always found that to be deficient in trying to understand what really makes what we often call colloquially the idea of India. The idea of India is not about heroic figures who triumphed despite all odds. The idea of India is a constellation of concepts and notions and arguments that have been forged through struggle, through failing, through fallibility, through limit. And if we were to today think about these thinkers who encourage us to look at ourselves inward and look at where we have gone wrong, where is it that we failed to understand what our greatest strengths were and what our greatest risks, where our greatest risks lay, I could not find of two more important figures. And that's why I think what interested me about Ambedkar and Gandhi was that despite the verbiage around them, despite the saturation of the field of the literature around them, it was rare that they were understood as thinkers. And it has had a global effect. The global effect is that it is rarely argued or let alone persuasively demonstrated or even accepted that India is an idea, that we live by ideas, that our fundamental freedom resides in our freedom to think freely. And that is why I think these two figures draw me so powerfully.
What was the central question? The book is called Radical Equality. What was the central question to which, or the central seeking to which that book is the answer?
The book is, as you know, the subtitle has the expression risk of democracy. The book answers to the fundamental conundrum of our political life in India. And that is, this is to begin with, slightly complicated, but should be clear to us here. It's the relationship between freedom and equality. We believe that our greatest triumph in the last century lay in the freedom struggle, that somewhere the empire on which the sun never set was brought down by a heroic movement of people coming together despite their intractable diversity. And that is actually correct. We became what we became precisely because we were so different. And yet that rhetoric and that story, that narrative about our self-determination, about our freedom, obscured something more problematic about us, which is our absolute comfort with inequality and cruelty around us. It is true on the one hand that we mounted perhaps the most heroic struggle against perhaps one of the most sophisticated imperial powers known in modern history before the American Empire. But it is also true that in that triumphant moment, we forgot that our greatest problem was not freedom, but inequality. So radical equality is a recuperation of that problem.
So will you, and I know that this is a big ask, but will you distill for us what is Gandhi's, do they have a shared understanding of inequality? If not, will you tell us a little or talk us through what is Gandhi's understanding of Indian inequality? Does that differ from Ambedkar's?
That is several questions. Gandhi and Ambedkar are often understood as prime antagonists. They are prime movers of modern Indian political life, but they're also movers that move us in opposite directions. And that argument loses out something very fundamental about who we are as a people. And this is the question they ask. Both ask in very similar terms, although they arrive at answers that are very different. And this is a question about us as a democracy. Can the people rule? We know that common sense tells us that democracy is a rule of the people and by the people. Often it's not for the people at all, but that's a different conversation. Gandhi and Ambedkar force us or compel us to ask a more fundamental question, which is, are we capable of ruling ourselves? Rather than taking democracy as a common sense, the question to ask is whether democracy answers to our most important political and moral quests, whether we become something bigger than ourselves simply by claiming that we are the world's largest democracy. And I think this triumphalism is very rampant. Constitutions are undermined, minorities are suppressed, lynchings go unreported, institutions get compromised, from the Reserve Bank and to the Supreme Court and so on. The fight for institutions is a fight for ideas. And we do not, or we remain incapable of understanding that struggle in its true sense unless we understand what is it that constitutes us as a people. Why is it that we believe we are Indians? It's a very difficult, controversial question. And other than Gandhi and Ambedkar, I don't think there are many philosophers or thinkers of political life who stare at this question with the courage that these two do.
And what does Ambedkar arrive at as a formulation? What constitutes us as Indians?
He's skeptical that anything constitutes us as Indians. And that is what I find very radical about Ambedkar. The perennial skepticism, the ability to doubt, the ability to question our civilizational arrogance. When is it that we started to believe that we are a country of nonviolence? When actually the thing that moves us the least is the violence around us. And it is in that indifference that Ambedkar finds the greatest compromise we have made in our moral pursuit of democratic life. Now, it is actually true that he writes the Constitution, and much of why and how we come to this democratic reality is because of his constitutional genius. And yet there is a profound skepticism in him. This answers, I think, more directly to your first question. We read these thinkers, at least I read Gandhi and Ambedkar, because these are the only two thinkers who allow us to look inwards into what has become the fundamental tenet of our civilizational arrogance, of our muscular nationalism. If we are so robustly and rigorously Indian, we shouldn't be forced to or compelled to sing a national anthem in a movie theater. It just doesn't happen. Unless there is some grave threat or insecurity we feel about that very civilization. And to read these two figures is to understand that there is another idea of India which we perhaps need to reclaim.
Both these thinkers in some ways were occupied by the idea of the majority. And I think you've said somewhere that Ambedkar is one of the foremost theorists of majority. Now that's a word we hear a lot these days, both the political majority, but also, will you tell us in what form the idea of the majority occupied them? And did they see it as potential or as a threat?
There are two answers to that. Gandhi thinks of majority as our ability to absolve ourselves of all political and moral responsibility. Right? We start to claim that we are in a majority at the very moment when we decide we will actually hold ourselves accountable to nothing, because we are in a majority, we are in a large number. For Ambedkar, majority is a technique. It's a technique of rule, it's a technique of violence, and it is the deployment of numbers for social ends. They devote so much time to it, partly because it is the majority that makes social tyranny possible within the framework of democratic life, right? So we can, for example, argue that we are a democracy, and there is absolutely no doubt that we are a thriving, robust democracy. But what they are concerned with is what are both the limits and the risks of this democratic life. And one of the risks that both see in the way Indians think of themselves, or Indians think the idea of India, about the idea of India, is that they believe that the majority has the right to be proven right every time. That we are right precisely because we are in a majority. Gandhi wrote this 1909 book, Hind Swaraj. It's a very slim book in which he says that history has proven that the majorities are often wrong, and it's the minority that is right. In fact, to be right or to be truthful is to already be in a minority, right? And that radicalism is what helps us understand a new form of equality. He's very clear that one of the problems of being in the majority is that we come to believe, or we inhabit a realm of entitlement where we are just right. It's ontologically or philosophically given that we will be right. And therefore, we are responsible for nothing. And he writes this beautiful line in Hind Swaraj where he says, "The British have not taken India. We have given it to them."
In both worldviews, what was the greatest threat to democracy that they saw?
The greatest threat to democracy for both of them was a categorical confusion, which was simply this, that we take our liberties to be license, that our everyday freedoms to live freely without interference of the state or the neighbor or the enemy or the armed insurgent or the political dissident or the urban Naxal and so on. Every invented enemy, right, has to be understood as a response to something much graver, much more serious. And that threat is the idea that we have stopped living truthfully or with courage. The greatest threat to democracy comes from a generalized fear that we can't speak up, that we can't think freely. Or for Ambedkar, this was Gandhi, and for Ambedkar, the greatest threat to democracy comes from a kind of indifference in which freedom has ceased to matter to us. We have conflated freedom with choice. The more choices we have, we believe the freer we are. And I think the conflation of freedom with choice, the greatest example of this regime of choice is not actually modern capitalism, but the Indian caste system. And I think that debilitates democracy from its very inside.
So I think Ambedkar in particular, Gandhi as well, but Ambedkar in particular, and with the annihilation of caste, but has a searing critique of Hinduism. And I think you've said before that he says, if you think about freedom, you will probably cease to be a Hindu. What does that formulation mean? That's a radical statement.
Yes. It's so radical that it will be too radical to actually answer it for everyone. Every Hindu should actually answer that question or ask that question to herself and himself. Is the universal or the cosmological world in which the Hindu order or the Hindu society thrives or lives, and it thrives beautifully. Ambedkar has never had any doubt that this society is a work of genius, that this is a society with the kind of conceptual richness and moral heft that you find in very few societies. And the genius of this society is that it allows us to be equal within a framework of hierarchy. We are hierarchical, and we use different words in urban India for that: privilege, entitlement, and so on. But the magic of this system is the idea that we can be equal, or we have come to believe that we are equal, while staying completely true to the idea of hierarchy. Which is why you see or you hear often in India a kind of antagonistic definition of politics. So if you say, look, a child has been hurt by rubber bullets in Srinagar, the first response you get is, yeah, but what about the child of that army Jawan who was killed? Right? That form of antagonistic construction of politics in which freedom has been, or the quest for our freedom has been replaced by a perennial hostility is what debilitates us. Now, the question genuinely to ask here is, what does Hinduism have to do with it? Are Hindus necessarily that problematic or that Hindus are not problematic. They're unconcerned with servitude. They're unconcerned with conditions of servitude, not necessarily towards domestic help and so on, towards which the urban Indian has a very benevolent attitude. It's the condition in which this kind of civility and domesticity and servitude thrive together that the Hindu should ask more. And the Hindu should ask because it's in the, not because it's religion. Hindu is a euphemism here for the majority of this country. And for Ambedkar, the greatest challenge is to think conceptually of this brilliant society in which civility and servitude can thrive together within the four walls of the same house.
So the scriptures, in particular the Gita, and both have read the Gita fairly extensively. It seems to occupy a central place in their imagination. Will you tell us a little bit about, well, Ambedkar's relationship with the Gita and how it differs from Gandhi?
I mean, Gandhi's reading of the Gita is so full of fallacy that it's brilliant. He reads the Gita and it works. I mean, part of its brilliance lies in that it works. And part of its brilliance lies in the fact that we have come to inherit the Gandhian version of the Gita, which is that the Gita is about duty. You follow your duty, you obey the laws of your office, and leave the rest in the hands of something transcendent. Purusha and so on. The Gita has nothing to do with violence for Gandhi. On the contrary, it is a text of non-violence. If all of us follow our duties in the way that the Gita prescribes, there will be no violence around us. And we have, as a society, inherited that very, very strongly. Ambedkar is drastically different. And it is brilliant for the way it speaks truth to power. And his reading is literal. He says, look, the Gita is actually a poem composed to describe a moment of a bloody fratricide in which one transcendent figure, Krishna, emerges to convince this hesitant warrior to go kill his brothers. There is no way in which you could, by any stroke of imagination or luck, forget theoretical finesse, actually argue that the Gita is not a text of war, that the Gita is not a text of fratricide, that in some ways our tradition does not say, kill your brothers over state or property. And that is the fundamental disjuncture, I would say, in how Gandhi and Ambedkar read different texts, the Manusmriti, the Upanishads, the epics.
Tell us about how they read the Manusmriti, because the Manusmriti now comes up in the popular imagination frequently. What was their reading of the Manusmriti?
Ambedkar's, again, reading of Manusmriti was very, very generous. He thought it was a work of genius. Because the greatest project of social pacification, the idea that we were not an active population, that we were a people interested in solutions, Jugaad is the more colloquial version. We were interested in seeking solutions rather than asking difficult questions. That the Manusmriti is a great example of. I mean, one of the problems or limits of the Indian imagination that Ambedkar sees is that we have forgotten how to ask questions. We have forgotten how to ask conceptual questions that address concrete reality. And that freedom to think and its eventual death is what the Manusmriti actually stands for. There are a great many lines that are popularly recited, but there are others that are also widely known, like pour molten lead into the ears of the Shudra and a woman who dares to read the scripture. Now, one could argue that you take only what you like within a tradition and then discard the rest. There are good things in the Ramayana, I'll take that. I will, for example, today not take the idea of Agni Pariksha from the Ramayana. I would take Maryada Purushottama's other virtues. I would not take that demand he makes of his wife seriously. I don't think that works. I don't think we can actually take a good snippet from an epic. It's an epic for a reason. And because its coherence comes from the calibration of violence and non-violence. And we can't actually say that as a society, if we believe in epics that are about war, somewhere we are still completely oblivious to war, or we are non-violent. We are indifferent to violence, but we are not non-violent.
So in the same way that you referred to taking snippets from epics, it seems like at the moment the Hindu right takes snippets from both these thinkers because there is a concerted attempt to appropriate both Gandhian and Ambedkarite thought. Is there any resonance in Gandhi, Ambedkar, and the way the Hindu right sees both thinkers?
The Hindu right likes them both. And once you decide you will not read them, it's easy to like anyone. But once you start reading them, I think it becomes more and more difficult to appropriate them. With Gandhi, the historical facts are out there. He was assassinated by someone. Now, what I find very interesting about Gandhi's assassination is that his murderer was almost a mirror image of him. The same sort of austerity, the same sort of discipline, the same obsession with reading of the Gita, the same commitment to brahmacharya. Almost all the monastic principles of classical Brahminic or epic life were followed with a similar sort of rigor in both Godse and Gandhi. And it is this kind of parallel that should give us more pause about how certain forms of seemingly austere or monastic or ritualistic practices conceal something much graver and much more dangerous in our social life and in our family life. The Hindu right wants to appropriate Ambedkar, on the other hand, for very specific reasons. Questions range from whether Ambedkar was an Islamophobe, or whether he was a critic of, more recently, a critic of Article 370 and so on. But if you read the sum total of these thinkers' works, it becomes unavoidable. The fact is unavoidable that they can't be appropriated because there is not a trace of civilizational arrogance in them. I mean, Gandhi has this brilliant sentence in 1942. He declares 5 years before the British leave, he tells the Viceroy, you don't have to leave India. India is as much yours as it is mine. In no other anti-imperial struggle do you see a leader tell the colonizing master, stay. You don't have to leave. And I think that inwardness, that ability to direct the most searing critique of ourselves towards ourselves is what remains inappropriable. And I think and this is not just the Hindu right, this is the global resurgence of the populist right, whose greatest victim, I believe, is our critical faculty, is our ability to think. And it's with the end of our ability to think that populist leaders come to political office.
I just want to touch, you've said somewhere that the Constitution in itself, Ambedkar's Constitution in itself, is an insurrectionist act, or it's insurrectionist. Will you tell us what you mean by that? What about the foundational document that defines the idea of India, so to speak, is insurrectionist?
What defines the idea of India, both constitutionally and socially, is that this will be an ever-changing idea. India is a situation. India is an experiment. India is not a settled entity. We are Indians almost by, and I would say this, and this could sound controversial, but we are all Indians almost by chance, because of certain specific historical moments in which we decided that our greatest strengths lay in our difference. So the idea of India, even the constitutional idea of India, is an idea which subscribes to or adheres to or commits itself to absolute and sometimes insurmountable difference. Ambedkar is a very interesting, peculiar constitutional figure in the history of global constitutions. Nowhere in any other tradition, constitutional tradition, do you have the man who's responsible for writing it declare within 2 years that if this constitution does not work, I will burn it in the same way I burned the Manusmriti. That is what is insurrectionary. Now, it could seem controversial right now because of the ways in which the constitution is being compromised, seemingly or otherwise. But that compromise of the constitution is within the order of constitutional latitude, within the order of separation of powers. Ambedkar's idea of the constitution was a document that spoke relentlessly and ceaselessly to what the people wanted. He was one of the great theorists of the plebiscite. You want to take away something from Kashmir, or Jammu and Kashmir, give them a referendum. You want to create a new Muslim state on your northwestern frontier, do a referendum. That element in which the answer to the question, can the people rule, was always yes. That we don't need heroic leaders to tell us that they are our saviors is what makes that constitutionalism insurrectionary.
And before we end, I am going to shift this conversation back to you rather than both Gandhi and Ambedkar. There is, we've spoken of this before, a story as to how you arrived at your name, because you did not start out Aishwary Kumar. Was this your own insurrectionist moment?
I wish I could say yes. No, and I often tell you, one of the myths that the classical Hindu lives by, or we all know of this, is the belief that when the Hindu crosses the high seas, he loses his caste. And Ambedkar thought that this was one of the greatest myths of our times. In fact, when the Hindu goes overseas, he takes his caste and implants it right there. I mean, he just can't leave it. And our surname, our family name, is a very big indicator of that. So I started out as a Ghosh, you're right. Or did you not say that?
I didn't, but yes, you started out as Ghosh.
I let it out, yeah.
And you arrived at Kumar. Why did you arrive at Kumar?
Yeah, so not for that reason, not because I was anti-caste at that point. I was 8. But I wanted my name to sound like Kishore Kumar. Because I was training briefly, I used to sing, and the scholarly dimension of that, as you know, is more interesting because of the book on R.D. Burman, the music composer that I'm right now working on.
But in changing your name, because you wanted to sound like Kishore Kumar, can you in fact sing like Kishore Kumar?
No, absolutely not.
And yet, will you give us 2 lines of a song, because you can sing?
As a witness, I've just had a glass of warm water brought, so I'm totally losing my voice. So.
I'm sure Kishore Kumar had bad days too.
Yes, and those bad days were better than entire humanity put together. But that's a different issue. Kishore Kumar's bad day, yeah. I can try. This song is actually composed by his father, not by R.D. Burman, but by Sachin Dev. When he fell ill, and R.D. then finished the recording. This was often celebrated as Kishore Kumar's last final song for Sachin Dev Burman. It's from the 1975 film Millie.
Aishwary, thank you for doing the Kumar name proud. Thank you for that conversation.